pleased, and I think most of you are very pleased with what we've done so far. As Khachik mentioned yesterday, the Armenians and Progressive Politics conferences began in 2006. Not as your typical academic conference. We have many academic conferences, which have academics talking to academics largely. That's not our purpose of our conferences here. And you can tell that just from the panelists that we've had. We have journalists, filmmakers, activists, and academics, of course, because the purpose is not just to discuss theories and try to duel, which one of our theories is better, but it's actually try to do something practical and to try to move forward, which is really the goal of this final closing panel, is to say, okay, we've heard much today. We've heard on a number of different subjects, and in fact, in some ways, the panels we've had today are kind of a progression. In the morning, we heard about some of the obstacles to justice for the Armenian cause, which the road to justice, of course, is the theme of today's panel, today's conference. And how do we get there? And in the morning, we heard about some of the obstacles. What are the obstacles in the area of the media? What are the obstacles in the area of government, of politics, of Turkish-Armenian relations, etc.? Our most recent panel on reparations was starting to talk about what we can do about it. Reparations, this new, this fairly new move within the movement towards justice of saying we don't just want recognition, that reparations is, as Tom pointed out, independent of recognition and is vital from a legal point of view and from the point of view of justice. And so now what we'd like to talk about, I'll give each of our panelists, one from each of the prior panels and one additional, 5 minutes to talk about where they see we can take this forward. Because the purpose here is not just to have a conference, everyone go home, we're happy we have a conference. The purpose is to create a movement. To create a movement that will move us towards justice for the Armenian cause, will move us towards working with other groups, with other ethnic groups, with other political groups, to try to find ways to move this cause forward. So to begin, I would introduce our first panelist, Antranig Kasbarian of the Tufenkian Foundation and the AR Central Committee, the host of this conference.
Okay, thanks, Dikran. Pleasure to be here with you. My sense is that where do we go from here means let's engage in a discussion, starting with the panelists, but hopefully involving all of you, on specific ways in which we can push the ball forward. Not simply as concerned Armenians or concerned progressives, but as hopefully activists in one way or another. As I was thinking about what to say, I thought back a few decades and I realized that, as Hank Terrio said earlier today, we live in a particularly rich and complicated landscape for activism. Whether we live in diaspora, or whether we live in the homeland, and depending on the issues that we happen to take on. I think back to my coming of age in the 80s and 90s, and how things seemed at least simpler back in the days prior to Armenia's independence, for example. I think in the long years of the Cold War, many Armenians, especially in diaspora, sort of formulated or framed a question which was, where do you stand on the issue of independence for Armenia? And those, particularly of the nationalist bent, generally said pro. And aside from pronouncements, beginning in the late 80s, would often take positions. And there are people I see in this room who played solidarity roles, supportive roles for the self-determination movement in Nagorno-Karabakh, for the dissident movements that actually turned into independence movements in Armenia. But as Armenia became independent, I think during the 1990s, many of us found that formulation to be insufficient. And we began to think in terms of what kind of Armenia, what kind of an independent Armenia is desirable and just. Is it an Armenia that simply has a tricolor flag and a seat at the United Nations? Or is it an Armenia endowed with social justice, one in which there is wide economic opportunity, where there are free and fair elections? These are questions that became relevant in the 90s, and they're just as relevant today. So what kind of Armenian independence, I think, became a much more rich and fruitful question for activists seeking justice. Well, similarly, I think some of the subjects that we've dealt with today also have become more complicated, rich, fruitful, fraught with pitfalls. I think, for example, about Armeno-Turkish dialogue. For those who followed the issue, 10, 15 years ago, a conference like this probably would have been unimaginable in diaspora. The idea of bringing together progressive Armenian and progressive Turkish intellectuals to talk with a common frame of reference, even with differing points of view, is largely unimaginable in the Armenian diaspora. Today, I think more and more it is becoming reality, if not the norm. I think we're pretty far from the norm still. But again, I think back to early dialogue efforts. In the early 2000s, we had efforts such as the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission, known as TARC, which I think set the bar pretty low. In those days, it seemed that the very notion of dialogue itself was innovative and progressive by itself. But I think we know better now. And dialogue between, say, Kunduz Aktan and Alexander Arzumanyan is not viewed as terribly progressive by Armenians today, who would much prefer to see human rights activists, journalists, liberal intellectuals, and others meeting one another head-on. So I think we've moved forward in that regard. Again, what kind of dialogue? Is a dialogue that is simply seeking somehow to break a wall? Or is it a dialogue actually seeking justice? Is it a dialogue that simply seeks to avail itself of abundant funds that the U.S. State Department puts out for reconciliation initiatives? Or is it dialogue that really stems from an interest rooted in justice? I would say the same thing regarding the question of reparations. And here I speak from a peculiarly diasporan Armenian nationalist viewpoint. I think people of my generation, certainly older generations, were brought up to believe in a cumulative model, that is, recognition, then reparations, then restitution of an Armenian homeland. And I think as a number of speakers, I think Tom comes to mind, Hank Terrio comes to mind, have indicated that one need not be predicated on the other, that these movements can actually work in parallel. They can sometimes synergize and feed off each other. But today, it's a much more complicated landscape. We should not be teaching ourselves or teaching others that somehow reparations for the Armenian genocide depends on recognition. It doesn't depend on recognition. There are multiple ways of attacking justice, and as Tom said, there are multiple overlapping grievances. So I think today, for budding activists, it's a very rich time. And I think it's never been so rich, whether you're an architect or an artist or a journalist or a lawyer. There is some intervention you can make in this landscape to play a role towards justice. And not just justice for Armenians, but justice within a wider context embracing Armeno-Turkish relations. So I think I'll stop there, and if I have more to say, I'll blurt it out later.
Thank you. Carla.
Thank the organizers again for creating this forum. I've been talking to people during the day and have had interesting conversations, and just a couple of more impressionistic points I wanted to raise now. I mean, the first is that wearing my journalist hat, not my Armenian hat, I believe, and I believe to this day, and I don't think I'll ever change my mind, that the most important thing we can do as journalists in a free society is to shine a light on the facts and what we believe to be the truth. And that the open society that defends that value of a free media has to be defended wherever you are in the world, whether it be America, whether it be Europe, whether it be Armenia. That open society is constantly being challenged at an economic level. The parameters of discussion are always narrowing, and we must always be able to defend it. And so I think that the most important thing for me as a journalist is to say, right, we must continue to shine a light on the lies, the denial, even though it's old and we're used to it and it's a habit. The need to keep talking about it if not to educate the newer generation, the younger generation, so that you continue to know that the so-called, conflict or balancing of the facts or whatever as we heard earlier, the right way of putting it, creating doubt, that is a tactic and it is something that has to be exposed for now and forevermore, whatever happens, number one. The second thing that struck me was that many of the people in the room here are children or grandchildren of survivors. And our parents and grandparents didn't have the luxury of having these conversations because their total effort was about survival and mixing into this country or the country that they were in. And so now that I feel like I'm standing on their shoulders, I feel I have absolutely no choice, given the education I've been given, that's been bought for me. I have no choice but to defend the voices of the survivors and the eyewitnesses of the genocide. I have heard in the last 6 months 400 testimonies from Armenian genocide survivors, many of them from the 70s and the 80s. And let me tell you, I thought I knew what had gone on, but it wasn't until I heard that detail that it really struck me what happened. And it creates an obligation that we can't ignore them. Whatever form it takes, whether it be legal, whether it be in the arts, whether it be in forging new relationships with other groups who've suffered from genocide, we cannot ignore these people because they were murdered and a crime was committed. I know it's a truism to say it almost. We all know this, but that reality is there and it's still hanging out there. They must be, in some way, their justice must be done to them. And finally, I would say that, and Noam Chomsky, at the end, those of you may not have heard the very last thing he said last night when I think David Barsamian says, how hopeful are you or how pessimistic are you? I don't know exactly how the question was. And his answer was, even though it was very soft, you may not have heard it, he said, well, I still think that there's room for activism, there's room for change, there's room for our individual action, and I believe that too, because so much of what we've discussed today is really about ideas. It's about ideas, and we have managed to change major movements through different ideas. We just haven't reached the critical mass in all these ideas to get the change. But that doesn't mean that human agency, individuals, and ideas can't change things. And that's what gives me hope. So for what it's worth, I think we've had our Armenian progressive politics inspiration, at least I have had it today, and it's got me thinking.
Carla, I'd now ask Bilgin to give her thoughts.
Yes, thank you. It was for me also a really very interesting conference, taking a lot of ideas and perspectives with me. Maybe I'd like to start with something that Edwin said in his speech when he raised the question about, does the Kurdish party, or how does the Kurdish party position itself with regard to reparations, right? It's a very important question. And of course the question is, to me, first of all, has the Armenian Revolutionary Federation ever asked this question? It would be important maybe to start there, right? But Hank just gave me this, the resolution of justice, the report that he just talked about. I'm happy to pass this on, and hopefully there will be translations in other languages about the report on the reparations for the Armenian genocide, and it would, certainly build a basis for more discussion. I know there are other reports, but what I would like to say is maybe just that this has to be enforced on both sides about this issue. And, well, not just sides, I don't want to talk in terms of sides, but to seek justice, or justice is not just an affair for one group. It's only everybody needs justice that actually sustainable longevity of justice can be there. This year, I was invited to Beirut during the Armenian genocide commemoration events, and I took my young cousin with me. She's studying at the university, living in a gated community in Istanbul. And the reason why I took her along was, and Dikran met her, actually we were at the same conference. The reason why I brought her along was I just wanted her to see in a room informed Armenians, right? Because in Istanbul, you know, it would be hard for her as a non-political, you know, non-interested, you know, just regular university student to even, you know, put faces with names and with histories together, right? Because every day she's just exposed in the Turkish media about, you know, the Armenian diaspora is this or that, right? And it was an amazing weekend for her, right? She met a lot of young students at AUB from the Armenian Heritage Foundation, and it was a very transformative event for her, at least. And I think that's what, you know, why should you just go to Beirut? It would be great if more and more people would also come, Armenians would also come and claim this land and claim the territories, I mean, with their physical presence by visiting Turkey also. I think this would be a very important step. I know that George and Patrick are going now frequently with different groups. I'm reading the interesting reports in the Armenian Weekly that come from these visits, and this kind of encounters, really one-to-one encounters, are important to go beyond just an ideological fight and a cold, you know, exchange about, you know, what is a reparation or what is justice, what is an acknowledgement of justice. And that in the past years, more of these encounters and exchanges are happening. Arlex was also talking to Damon's talk about that. And I think, you know, really claiming with your own physical presence that what also belongs to you is very important in this process. That would be one way to push a little further the road to justice. But I gave today already in my presentation the one direction I think is very fruitful, which is an intensified Kurdish-Armenian dialogue and exchange. And building up on that, the question about what is progressive politics, I think Ron had brought that up, and it's an important issue because both for Kurdish progressive politics as well as for Turkish progressive politics or Armenian progressive politics, the key obstacles and challenges, I think, are not too different. And so in this way, I agree that this kind of meetings under the banner of progressive politics are really extremely important. Of course, even more if they include more women, as I said. And coming back, I had ended that presentation, but when I was looking at this very beautiful program, brochure of the conference, I realized that actually one of the women I adore the most in Turkey, Erin Keskin, who's a very courageous human rights advocate, who has been fighting not only for the Armenian cause, but also Kurdish struggles for more than 15 years now. She's a woman on this picture, right? And this is a picture of the 2010 commemoration when the Sadete mothers, these are Kurdish mothers, seeking their missing sons for more than, I think they first started to meet in 1996, and until today they keep on meeting in Istanbul, in Beyoğlu, holding up the pictures of the sons and daughters who were killed under custody or in other ways by unknown perpetrators, as it is called, by the state. And in 2010, they were carrying the pictures of those who were deported on April 24th, 1915. So when I looked again at this picture, I realized, well, okay, actually, we have here already a very good start. Erin Keskin, the human rights lawyer, she just received last week an award for human rights for the work that she does, and she dedicated it to the memory of Zabaye Zayan and Sakina Jansus. I don't have to tell you who Zabaye Zayan is to you, but I mean, I saw Melissa Vidal and Diana Ekmecioglu before we've written about her. And also also you editing the book. Sakina Jansus was a key member of the PKK who was murdered in 2013, along with two others. And this dedication, I think, where we can invite Erin Keskin next year and ask why she has dedicated this award to Zabaye Zayan and Sakina Jansus, but I do think that there's an important indication about what kind of progressive politics are possible with more women included in the discussion.
urgency about these matters. We've gotten to the point where it's become ritualized. There's a great danger in the ritualization of it because everyone's doing it. We've got the expected moves and the expected counter moves, and we're very apt to be caught off guard. And one of the things that could be counts as being caught off guard is a pseudo-apology next April 24th from Turkey, which will take the wind out of the sails of any possible public effort for a very long time. And I say that with a very heavy heart because I honestly think that that's what's coming. But let's see. And if that's what comes, then we definitely have to redouble our effort to articulate our claims as solidly as we possibly can, because it's going to get very hard to get public attention otherwise in any way. And in that regard, bringing cases, not only in Turkey but around the world, we have to use the piecemeal tools that we have right now. These are not adequate to solve the problem of the Armenian genocide or recognition or reparations, but they're what we have. We have to use them all. We're not using them all yet, so we need to organize ourselves better in that regard. And when we do this, we have to understand we're not just doing it for the Armenians. Actually, the impunity toward genocide is the major threat to humanity. That we just have to shoulder this burden. But we don't have to shoulder it alone. I agree that we should be reaching out, working with lots of others. And a lot of people are already working with lots of others to raise this issue and not to allow impunity to become the new norm with regard to genocide. And finally, I think we should remember that redemption is really important for Turkey. We want, as Armenians, to have a neighbor that is a good citizen of the world, of the community of nations. We need a neighbor that feels that is not spooked by Armenians and is not spooked by Armenia. Right now, there, from everything I can tell, there's a certain amount of unhealthy attitudes toward Armenians and fear of Armenians and what we might demand or what we might do, and that has to be lifted away. And the best way to do that is redemption. Redemption. You have to do something to get redeemed. It's not just the admission of guilt or apology, but it's doing something concrete, whether it's the restoration of a certain symbolic land reparations, whether it is money, whether it's a combination of rights, whether it's simply living up to existing international obligations. It's up to Armenians to encourage and help shape the solution. Because unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be the creativity or the interest with what no doubt looks like the petty problems of a small country in Washington or New York or London or Geneva or anywhere else. But we have to shape it and we have to sell it. That's not easy, but that's really what has to happen. When I say sell it, that is we have to actually convince people that this is a way out of the Armenian genocide predicament, because it's gone on for too long. Thank you.
Any questions, comments about what we can do, what you've learned from today, and how we can move forward, please?
Well, just one thing that I've always been thinking is that, we need to make it less about us when we talk to Turkey and more about them. Because people, when they're dealing with a situation, it always comes back to, why should I do this? What do I have to gain from it? I mean, Turkey's paid a tremendously high cost for what they've done. They've been stunted in democratic development, social development, economic development. The cost of what's been paid in Turkey for this distorted history pathway has been substantial. Whether that means that scholarship needs to be done around that to establish those costs in a more material way that are more understandable, or maybe changing the dialogue to some degree to talk about the costs. What does this cost Turkey, and why should you want your best days to be behind you instead of in front of you?
I agree with that. Going to what Tom was referring to before, the way that the genocide issue has been used against them, I think it's been described as the Damocles sword. And essentially the argument would be, do you want to get rid of this Damocles sword? Don't deal with the United States, don't deal with Germany, deal with the Armenians that resolve the issue. So I think it's a very good suggestion. Other comments or questions?
I don't know when or where exactly this was, but it was recent, and I had not heard this story before, that in the 80s, that this would have been under which government in Turkey? Anyway, I should formulate that.
Probably Özal.
Thank you, yes. That basically a question was posed, and I don't know if it was by whom. Shall we just go ahead and do something here? Shall we make an acknowledgement? What are the costs? What are the consequences? Is this something we can do? Because we're tired of this. We're going to make this, bring this to an end. And the short version of the answer that I got of these deliberations was no. They decided to, stick to the script. It would be interesting. I'd be interested in knowing more about that. What kind of deliberations there were? What kind of arguments were made then? And whether those are valid now for Turkey.
Other questions? Yep.
I would like to comment on, brief comment basically on the change of the, quote unquote, the Turkish state. Turkish state is not the blatant denialists of 80s and 90s anymore. They have undergone through a process, now they're a sophisticated denialism. And they are getting rid of their baggages fast. They're trying to get rid of the Kurdish issue, they're trying to sort it out. But the Armenian issue is still a red line. But what they're going to do is a pseudo-apology. I'm also expecting that. And there is also talk, well, to understand Turkish politics, you might nowadays read op-eds of obscure columnists, but they are writing on some, things that they hear, etc. So there's this talk of offering citizenship, for example, to Armenians to descendants of Armenians who were displaced in 1950. Like they are going after symbolic gestures, and then they might claim that, well, we've done our part. And there's also the talk of just memory. Things happened on all sides. It was wartime. So there is a sophisticated denialism that is coming. I just wanted to, make note of that.
Let me comment on this briefly. I agree with most of what you say, but I worry a little bit. I worry because I think we need to distinguish carefully between these sorts of diplomatic tricks. You're portraying the sophisticated denialist machinery as so many clever tricks, versus the very real changes, albeit limited changes, that have occurred within Turkish civil society over the last decade or two, where there are now limited cracks, limited niches for freedom of expression, and I think we're witness to that. So I think we need to be careful. There are some things that I would call real and substantial that we need to develop, we need to encourage. And there are other things that are obviously engineered by the state, by the denialist state with its aims in mind.
I would just like to add that I think that if I were trying to come up with some way to subvert the Armenian diaspora in America in 2015, I would do exactly what you're suggesting. Is that it would be the easiest thing to do because they've already done a form of it. They've sent out these little trial balloons in the last couple of years, and non-Armenians will come up to me and say, "Oh, isn't this wonderful news? Wonderful news! There's reconciliation." And I said, "No, not wonderful news."
How do you preempt it?
That's a good question. And part of the thing we haven't discussed, and this is why I think it's very clever, it's the one way to divide us because we are not united. All of our different, not just parties, but the whole range of opinion in the diaspora, going from I really don't want to talk about it to, if they just winked at me, that would be okay. Or, if they just said, I'm sorry, or all the way to land and everything that goes with it, access to the sea, Mount Ararat, So those are legitimate concerns. And I'm not trying to, diminish them, but I'm saying we are not united. I don't know if it's possible to be united because it's part of our experience of being victims that we're still in pain about it. So how can we possibly be expected to be united about it? But it's the easiest thing to do. All you have to do is say, we're sorry. And then a few Armenians will say, that's enough for me. And the others who don't agree will have an argument amongst ourselves, and then that will be sufficient for Americans to say, well, okay, they did their best, and that's it.
Can I say maybe something else? I I'm a political scientist, so when I hear citizenship, I cannot just so quickly dismiss it and say it's, make it a part of diplomatic tricks. I think it would be, if that would be materialized, I think there's a tremendous opportunity in it, just in terms of votes, very plainly, right? Like, we're talking here from a very, very tiny small group to potentially, increasing, if really, apparently, the descendants, all of them are getting citizenship. We're talking here about serious numbers, if that would be the case. I'm just saying, I had many discussions with friends about that, who very much also said, oh, these are just against symbolic measures. Of course they are, but, they also contain within them some political opportunity. And again, coming back to the Kurdish spin of that, there is the only opposition party we have right now is supporting Kurdish BDP, right, which is HDP right now. So, increasing that vote a little bit would be certainly not that bad in the political landscape in terms of electoral votes. I mean, this is also an aspect, but I definitely agree, of course, that these are, many symbolic and strategic measures will be tried out next year, for sure. But if the outcome would be citizenship, I wouldn't want to dismiss it so easily.
I want to comment another question, a couple of stuff that we are being progressive, and for the last 5 years maybe, the most articles that I write on my blog and website was some scenarios about 2015 and now. Why we didn't do this before? Why we Armenians were not prepared for this before? That's what I'm questioning in Turkey. For example, it's the first time that after 1957 in Turkey, many political parties, including the first Kurdish party, started to look for an Armenian MP, but there wasn't. Maybe there was. They were talking, but what were we looking for? Do we need this? And when after that, Davutoglu came with this speech, which is already some implementation of Russian Armenians, that I know that Russian Armenian lobby met with Davutoglu just before that speech, and give the idea that why you're not offering Turkish citizenship. Then he did this speech, that okay, we are offering Turkish citizenship, diaspora is ours diaspora. Okay, I was just thinking, yeah, Bilgin is right. Why we have to reject this also? Because just imagine, it's just a scenario. Okay, we are all talking about this, but can we imagine how many votes we can have from outside of the country for this? Just an example, in Belgium, there are so many Turkish people lives in there, and there are also Kurds and Armenians, a very tiny Armenian population, like 25,000. But for last 3 years that I'm half living in Belgium, I was trying to mobilize them, and we get 1,500 votes for the last elections, presidential elections in Turkey. That 1,500 approximately Armenians went to vote for Turkish president, not for Erdogan or Sedat. Actually, they went to vote. Yeah, Turkey is going to set up very well this next year. They're going to use this. When you're going to go to there, they're not going to accept, or they will put some old cases in front of us. But we have to mention it. Just before this panel, Edwin also was speaking about that. We have to also know more about Turkish laws, Turkish law system. It's changing and changing so fast. For example, European Court we are talking about. European Court, Human Rights Court is trying to get rid of these Armenian issues. They opened an office in Turkey just for this, saying that after the constitutional court in Turkey, before you come to European Human Rights Court, please go to the office in Turkey. If they say yes, we are going to start to read your case, not even accept it. This happened 2 years before. We didn't do anything. Yeah, Agos wrote about that. I reported about that. I interviewed with the guy even in there. But this is you know, whole preparation was coming, what can come in 2015 and afterward. And just change, we are saying, as a conclusion. When I was graduating from Armenian high school in Turkey, in Turkish history books, I was learning that I was bad, and I was the guy who was working with Russians. My ancestors were working with Russians against the Ottoman. This is the book that one of my followers posted, that there's a book in Turkey for teachers delivered this year. And it's saying that if you have students who are talking about Armenians, please tell them, during the First World War, they were together with Russians and became our enemies. And please let them write about it. And this is a textbook for teachers in Turkey, 2014. In my time, this was in the textbook of students. Now it's in the textbook of teachers to say them implement or make this happen. So, yeah, we have to be clever. But today in the morning, they were saying that, okay, we are a bunch of clever people in here, all around the world. Why we are not doing this? For me, I think after next year, let's pass this 2015. But we have to seriously think about what we are going to do with our culture, with our nation, with our nation state, who is playing with politics like a hobby. And really, as an Armenian, I'm really considering what's going to happen to Armenia next couple of decades. That's.
Tell us your blog. What's your
I can
website?
yield to anybody who's not has
Okay.
Just very quick, this issue of like the pseudo apology, I think is very important. But I'd like to point out two cases where even in one case a more genuine apology has not ended the issue. It's created, big opportunities. Australia in 1997 did a sort of landmark governmental report of 1,000 pages on just the taking of Aboriginal children and putting them into white homes and forced assimilation and so forth. Did a report, labeled it correctly as genocide, because it does fit the UN definition. And at that time, the Australian government essentially accepted this and accepted responsibility. Creating a huge, it's art, it's everything in Australia. Even today, you'll see this has just created a huge wave of dealing with things in Australia. But what's really interesting is subsequent, more conservative administrations, John Howard's sort of famous for this, now Tony Abbott's in the same camp, have recanted and rejected that apology and sort of gone the other direction, which is another thing that will likely happen if Turkey does acknowledge it will backtrack. Similar kind of thing has happened in Japan around the Genocide massacre, this sort of up and down, we acknowledge it now we stop, now we do, and now we don't. And that's actually fueled a lot of internal discussion within both countries because of this issue. So it may be a pseudo-apology, may actually be a real opportunity to open this up to the future, especially being able to point out why this, things are inaccurate. So I'd just like to say maybe being optimistic that this could open the door.
So I'm from Turkey. I'm Turkish. I'm from Turkey. So looking to Turkey gives me hope about many things. I think democracy will be the key and solution for many things. And for instance, the party that Kurdish party is the main one, HDP. The candidate of this party took approximately 10% of the votes in the last elections, and Selahattin Demirtas is one of the politicians in Turkey who is bravely talking about the Armenian genocide. So I think this is one of the positive things going on in Turkey. Last year we had many demonstrations in Gezi Park, and most of the people who attended were under 25 years old, so the young youth of Turkey is also believe democracy. And I think some of Turkish people apologized from Armenians in 2007, in 19th of January. Hundreds of people, including me, we marched in Istanbul in the funeral of Hrant Dink. And so I think all these things should tell to our Armenian friends that there is hope in Turkey about the change. And yes, the Kurdish movement is the main main group that will contribute to this change. So there's the seeds of the hope. So granting not only with his life, but after his death, helped us, the Turkish people, a lot to understand the Armenian genocide and why Armenians are suffering so much from this denial. So I think in any this kind of panel, there should be a panel for granting to understand his ideas and how he achieved to tell us, the Turkish people, there was a genocide. And I would like to finish with an intellectual. So intellectuals in Turkey had suffered a lot from the Turkish state. This is chronic suffering. And Sevan Nishanyan, an Armenian, is also now in the prison. He is an intellectual. He wrote about Kemalism and he criticized Kemalism a lot. On the other hand, he criticized Islam. So he criticized the two holy things of the Turkish state. And now, not because of his ideas, already there was a case that they give him 13 months of prison sentence. This is still going on, but now he is in prison because he constructed a 60 square meter house in his village for the mathematician students. So I think that this group, some people in this group, has to do something for Sevan Nishanyan. He has been in the prison since January 2014, and we don't know how long he will be there because there are 17 other cases going on for him. So I think this could be something that these people here in this room would think about, and to maybe we can form a group here and to start to think about what we can do. Yeah, so Sevan Nishanyan is my suggestion here, and also I would like to hear your opinions or if you did anything for him.
My problem is, I don't think we've really approached some of these. When it comes to this, the argument they use against Nagorno-Karabakh is territorial integrity. Where was that territorial integrity when the Germans and the Turks together convinced the United States to assist in the breakup of Yugoslavia? The people in Yugoslavia, the Serbs were the only ones that opposed the German occupation. Between the Serbs and the Greeks, the resistance they put up, they held off the invasion of the Soviet Union by more than 2 months. What would have happened if they had gotten there 2 months earlier? Stalingrad might have fallen, and that would have been the end. At that time, if Stalingrad had fallen, Turkey would have joined the Germans. There's no doubt about it. And the Armenians in Istanbul, the youth of Istanbul, they were already in the interior. They had been taken into the interior, they would have been killed. We don't seem to realize this country does not appreciate who the people are that helped us in the Second World War. And for that reason, I said at the time when this great breakup of Yugoslavia started, I had written a 24-page letter, ridiculously, to the president saying why that should not happen. And then I even sent a copy of that to the ANC office for them to use some of this stuff in there. I never heard a reply from the ANC office. But I think these are things that should be used. You have to go back to the, we allowed the breakup of Yugoslavia because of territorial integrity, and the only reason Bosnia probably came out elected to become independent was because the Serbs in Bosnia during the Second World War, the Germans allowed the Croats, who were their allies, to kill over 700,000 Serbs. That reduced the population in that area. These are things that I put in that letter, hoping that somebody would use this information. I really think these are things we should go after. Instead of just using Kosovo, the fact that, well, they gave Kosovo independence, they have to give it.
No, I mean, the concern there is correct. It actually goes to the big politics that Carla was speaking of. The United States and the Germans and everyone else are very selective. The UN Charter gives equal weight to both territorial integrity and self-determination. Yet, because it suits their purposes, the only time they talk about self-determination is if it's someone who's perceived as an ally, like the Kosovars, and not when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, not when it comes to a number of other cases. So that's absolutely correct. I think Khashik had something to say.
Yes, I'd like to address a few of the points that were raised. But let me start with Sevan. I think that's an important point. I mean, if anything, Panding's example is one where we realize that, a lot of intellectuals, particularly in Turkey, discovered traveling after he was murdered. And I think it's a challenge here. And also in the diaspora, by the way, many of us. So it's a challenge here for us that now that there is this Armenian intellectual who's being persecuted in Turkey, right, this is an important issue. However, the discussion here and the earlier discussions were pointing in a direction overall that was essentially a call to further engagement of Armenians in Turkey, right? The entire discussion about citizenship, issues like Western Armenia, issues like democracy, it was mentioned, for example, during the panel which I was moderating. And Ron Suni, I don't know if he's here. Ron Suni mentioned that democracy is important because that would lead to, recognition. But I mean, as Hank and others have pointed out, right? Democracy is never an indicator in and of itself of recognition, and you don't really need to go too far. Just look at the United States example, right? So, and then from there, I'm going to talk a couple of things about this further engagement issue, and try to put a spin on this that puts back the responsibility on the Turkish Kurdish majority on those lands. And here's how I look at this. 100 years ago, and Ron mentioned it today as well in his presentation, 100 years ago, there was a democracy and movement in Turkey, right? And the Armenians and Greeks and others were annihilated from those lands, and that's how, that entire fabric was destroyed. Now, what we're proposing here is through citizenship, etc., and other ways, right, including work that I do, right, going to Western Armenia, getting involved there, we're essentially proposing a return, but at the same time, this return is not without danger. We're asking the victim group to re-engage in full force, right, without realizing that we're putting too much responsibility and pressure on the group that was actually annihilated, and taking the responsibility, at least in significant part, away from the majority that is benefiting from that destruction and annihilation. And this is very important. And I will give the citizenship example to illustrate this point. And if you ask how many Armenians in the diaspora have actually gotten the Armenian passport, the numbers are not going to impress you. It's not in the millions, it's not even in tens of thousands. To think that there will be a critical mass of Armenians who are going to suddenly, millions of them, get enough Turkish citizenship, just embrace this, and then go and fight for democracy again with the Kurds, right? And try to enter into a political process in a country that clearly is not prepared for any of this kind of engagement, right? Is asking way too much from a nation, and again, minorities. I'm talking about Armenians, but you can say the same thing about Greeks, about Syrians, and all the oppressed minorities of the region, right? So I think, and I'm even critiquing myself here, because I am a proponent of further engagement, and I'm always been. But I think we have to be very careful when we push for this, and realize that there's an issue of responsibility as well. We need to be engaged, but we also have to realize that the people on the ground who are benefiting from the consequences of the genocide have to take on the responsibility of pushing for this much harder than we from a distance. This whole movement of let's all go there, let's participate, etc. Well, there is an Armenian state which has all kinds of democracy problems, and you know what? Many Armenians will say, why am I going to go and support democracy in the country that committed genocide against my people, instead of going and supporting democracy in my own country, which needs it as well, right? So I think these are important questions as we try to resolve and discuss these issues from a progressive perspective.
A few more questions. Yes.
I'm not a professor, a political scientist, a lawyer, or any of other occupations of the esteemed people I've heard talk today. I'm just a high school student. But ultimately, I feel my opinion and the voice of my generation is very important because it's going to fall on our backs to try and change the things that have been discussed in this room today. And I'll try to keep this brief, but it's so hard to market this idea of how can we fight for the Armenian genocide to people of my generation, especially considering the fact that we live in such a time where activism is so strong. I'll take, for example, the climate change march, which attracted 300,000 plus people, most of which were kids from my generation. And I saw many kids from my school going to this climate march and will not shut up about climate change now because it's so ingrained that they need to talk about this and they need to change. Meanwhile, me as an Armenian American trying to talk about the Armenian genocide, I can't be given the time of day in my school. So, someone mentioned earlier, it's like, how do we market this idea? I ultimately feel that the strongest suggestion that can be made today is how to market the idea of fighting for recognition of the Armenian genocide, progressiveness in Armenia, changing the current state of affairs in Armenia should be marketed to the youth, because we're the ones that are going to have to change it in the future, but we can't do that unless there's some kind of seed planted there that makes us, care. And that's why I say.
Yeah, there's a few things I wanted to say. One was that I've heard a lot of the extremes, and I just caution people that, just because we haven't achieved our final objective, it doesn't mean that nothing's been achieved. And just because there's been some change doesn't mean it's been everything's great. You know what I mean? It's like there has been change, nothing's been static. We have accomplished a lot. We're not where we need to be. So let's not be 100% pessimistic or 100% optimistic on either extreme. And I would just say that to follow what Kachi said, as I often do, the thing is that there are tangible things, and there's a tangible presence on the land today. I often look at things as our people were born on that land as a people. And we have every right to have a presence on that land. That is our right. I can't imagine a people that would be formed as a people, and no longer have rights to the land that they became a people on. And today, there are people still living there. And how they're treated is a good sign of how we would be treated. If even those amongst them today, Islamized Armenians that still live amongst them, that still, after 100 years and under amazing circumstances, still have a sliver of Armenian identity and are willing to acknowledge that sliver, okay? They should have the right that they're living on the land where their people was created. That identity should be allowed to come out. If that cannot happen, if that cannot be achieved, then there's no room for discussion about what rights we have there or what possibilities there are, because the country isn't ready, the people aren't ready. They haven't accepted the criminal act of what transpired to remove us from the land that we were born of. So, amazingly, beyond anything, I would be the first to admit that I would not have believed this possible before it happened. I would have questioned the wisdom in reopening Sukyeragos. But today, if you go to Sukyeragos on an average day, you will find 100 people walking through there daily, more. Many of them still wearing, they wear their Muslim attire, and they light candles. Who are Muslim women lighting candles for in Sukyeragos? It's their grandparents that were Armenians. This is an example. It doesn't have to be of the magnitude of Sukyeragos or the magnitude monetarily or investment-wise. There are chapels, churches. When we talk about return of churches and why it's important and use this as an example, and people say, well, who's going to use these churches? The people that live there will use them. The people that are there will treat them as the cultural center that Sukyeragos has become. The 40 Islamicized Armenians that went to Armenia this summer and spent 3 weeks there. This is just a small beginning. This was not preordained. It was not that the people of Diapaget were ready for this. It was thrust upon them. And I have no idea how they accepted. This is why I asked Bilgin a question earlier about this, is to understand where we're going with this, how prepared the people are. So if you're looking for a beginning of justice and not an end, this is a beginning place to start, to think about having Armenians on the land where we began as a people.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
Thank you.
Please.
It's three brief, solid questions. One is, I just want to sort of mention 3 points of attention that we might need to clean our minds. I don't have answers. One is focusing more on the Armenian community in Turkey, or not focusing, or being aware of people, and not necessarily those who are outspoken and writing others, but also those who are still silenced, that genocide acknowledgement might liberate their personal psychic existence. The second one is, as American Armenians, to be more vocal about the Native American issue, because not only as a humanitarian point, but also because that's one reason the U.S. might be reluctant, among other reasons, to go into the Armenian genocide, might be because there is also the Native American genocide, and there are parallels here about what to do. The third point I want to mention is that in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, which I don't know, I'm not very informed about the details of. However, I think perhaps we should not talk about that in the same manner that we discussed the genocide, because I think there might be more equal burden there between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I think perhaps as Armenians, if we are more aware of facts and how to keep that separate from our grievances about the genocide, that might also ultimately be everyone's best.
Thank you. I think we're gonna have, it's been a long day, so we're gonna cut it off here. Of course, you're all welcome to stay and continue the discussion as we did after the other. Before we close, on behalf of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation Central Committee, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors of this 2-day conference, the MIT Armenian Society and Alternative Radio. I'd like to thank the members of the organizing committee, whose names you'll see in your program, for their many months of very hard work in making this come together. I'd like to thank our panelists who come from around the world and around the country to take part in this. I'd like to thank our young people who are volunteers, who have been doing driving and 101 other items to make sure that this came together. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming, for giving your ideas, and for taking part here. And just to remind you that this is not a one-time thing. Please, we have a sign-up sheet outside. Please leave your contact information. We would like to make this an ongoing thing when we keep in communication, whether it's by email or it's by starting discussion groups or whatever else. We would like to continue. So please give us your contact information, sign up, and thank you all for coming today.